I am a descendant of a residential school survivor. My grandma Lula Beatty, maiden name is Morrow. They originated from Mollinosa, Saskatchewan. That's where the original land set was for Treaty 6 signing. And the effects that we have felt from the residential school, intergenerational effects, would be alcoholism, codependency, rigid disciplinary parenting, the emotional disconnectedness would be. I remember growing up in Christianity being told that if I were to ever attend a sweat, I would go to hell. Yeah, so I grew up believing that my cultural way was not the way to be. And then when I moved to Prince Albert when I was 7, I noticed a big culture change. Like there was a lot of different races, and I remember being ashamed that I was a First Nations kid. I remember being bullied and picked on, and when I tried to talk to my family about it, it almost seemed like my mother and my grandma they didn't know how to respond to it, so they left it be. And I later found that out because when in residential schools, you were ashamed also to be a First Nations student, a First Nations child. My mom was Métis, so she didn't really get that effect too much. She never received that too much, even in high school.
The things I heard about residential school was from my father and my mother, and both of my grandparents went, both sides. My mom's originally from Deschambault Lake, and my dad's from Stanley Mission area, but grew up in Otter Lake, well, Grandmother's Bay. They call it Gukumananikan Creek. And my father told me that one story about him being in the residential school is that when he was out on the trop line there at Macoun Lake, that's our family trop line, and there a plane picked him up to attend the residential school, and from there he didn't have no choice. It was time to go. He had no choice to go, and he had long blonde hair, probably about up to here when he was younger, when he got taken. And he spoke Cree, and every time he spoke Cree over there, he would get hit on his wrist, and bad stuff happened over there. And they poured pesticide in his hair, that yellow stuff, to burn off the lice, and which, like, they never had lice. There was no lice back then. And for them, for like those priests and stuff, said that you gotta burn off the lice and pouring that stuff. And they'd leave it in there for 24 hours, he said. 24 hours, and that thing was burning his head, and it was yellow pesticide or whatever they call it. And they cut his hair.
My dad was in residential school for 6 months, I think. Our family just completely, how do I say it? Not a family. They don't communicate. We're not a family. Like, we're so spread it out. We don't have that connection. We don't have that bond. We don't, hey auntie or hey uncle, or hey cousin. Like, that's how bad the family separated from each other. Like, their differences from everything just separated them. Because with education from the First Nations University, they teach you they make you do research. So you're researching the effects, what happened, and how it's a ripple effect. It's not just what happened then. That's not just what you're learning. You're learning how it's still affecting everybody. And then how it, like, keeps going, and you see that.
I have a picture of my dad, too, when he was in the residential school. That picture was in, like, 1969 or something, or more than that, I think. I think he's a very powerful person. And there it is.
Could you show it to the camera? A bit closer. That's good.
They both went here to this residential school, to the Prince Albert one here. And it was the same thing for her. She got cut and like she still has those ruler marks. You could still see them on her wrist. They both got sexually molested there. They said they wanted to put it behind them and move forward. All three of my older siblings all went to the residential school. And before they went, they all spoke Cree. And when they came back, they lost their language. And my older sister, she's like the second oldest for my brother. And she has a hard time today because she dealt with a lot in there. And she was in there the longest. And she's like, she has a bad, like she's into alcohol. My mom too is the same way. And my dad somehow managed to break the cycle of it. And like, anybody would like drink lots if they, like the treatment they had in there. Like my dad said that bad stuff happened there, and like when those men were doing stuff to them, young boys, and they couldn't do nothing because it was out of their control. Like you had to obey them.
No, I do have one family member that went to residential school, and that's my grandpa Jake Sanderson. Hearing how he got abused in residential school, it was bad. Like, why should a kid have to get taken away from his parents and go through stuff like that?
I can see it now. Like my mom has this drinking problem, and it's hard for her to overcome it. That's why she drinks all the time, is because she can't live with the fact that what happened there, and it's hard to break that cycle. Most of our people in the reserve are like pretty much broken from it, and it gets passed on, like the abuse. Like even if your family doesn't do it, your outside family, your members, like your cousins, your extended family, it comes to you eventually, like the abuse. And it's hard to get away from it, because like your family leave you with somebody they trust, and you don't know what happened to that person, and that person ends up doing that stuff to you too, and they were at the residential school too. So it's like it's a cycle that keeps going on, and people get sexually molested because of what they did, those priests. It's not a good feeling. Coming here is kind of opening my eyes to seeing stuff differently. And like when they first opened the residential school, like they were gonna make an Indian fit into society, and that's not how it worked. It was different. They broke our people being at the residential school. A lot of them like don't really know how to read and write because they didn't teach you that, like what they said they were supposed to do, like the government. They broke our children, and they're breaking us. For like a lot of us have in the north have drug and alcohol addictions and mental health issues.
It's that intergenerational violence and trauma. My mom experienced a lot of that when she was growing up. Like, they carried that pain with them, and they took it out on my mom. And in that, like, regard, my mom, I think I have to commend my parents for raising me the way they did, because they never, it's almost like they didn't have a chance to be good parents. Like, no one gave them the tools to know how to be good parents, but they managed to be good parents from it. But that's affected our lives, my mom's especially. I think, and she's an advocate for people who suffer from that intergenerational that violence and trauma.
Yeah.
Because she says there's not a lot of resources for people who are suffering from that intergenerational trauma, because you don't want to blame the parents for passing that pain down, because, well, that's not their fault. If the residential schools didn't exist, then they never would have done any of that stuff to their children. Mm-hmm. And there wouldn't be this cycle of pain that these families have to go through. It's about how we lost our culture, and we lost our language, and we lost our history. And there were, because of things like residential schools, and like when they first, like when the European settlers first started.
My grandpa was sort of, mean and strict with him and my Uncle Pat growing up, and he always told me that he always wanted to get away from him and didn't want to be around my grandpa, but he had to stay with him anyway because, that's his father. And I guess later on in life, we saw the effects of that growing up by him drinking, and he always didn't want to be that kind of mean person towards us, and he had to hold back so much pain. And I saw that with him and his drinking. Like, when he would drink, he would turn into a person that he wasn't when he was sober. Like, he would be the person he described his dad to be towards us, but we didn't go through no physical abuse or anything. It was more like getting yelled at sometimes. And I'm really glad that I didn't really get the very bad end of it, like, my father did. Stuff like that really angers me, but it's in a good way that makes me want to educate the future generations to come on stuff like this and how to avoid it. I just wish everyone could get educated about residential schools and how they affected First Nations people, because these days you go on social media, you see a post on the news about residential schools, and then you just see various people saying, "Oh, get over it, oh, get over it." Like, how are you supposed to get over something that just keeps on going and going and going? You can't just get over something that happened to you as a kid, especially being taken away at a young age like that.
My parents went, and 3 of my siblings went. And when I was 4, we moved off the reserve because my dad couldn't find a job on the reserve to put food on the table. So we had to leave our community. It still affected us because of how it affected my mother and my dad. They did the best they could. And they loved us very much, but you could tell that sometimes the communication was not there. There was a lot of assumptions. And my dad was an alcoholic because of the horror he went through at residential school. He says that you can never undo what they've done at residential school. So he said, well, why the use talk to it? He talked a little bit about sexual abuse, but he never actually said the word. All he said was all the little boys, and no little boys were left out, were bent over and sexually abused that way by the brothers, the priests, and whoever else was there. So they shut down their feelings a lot. At residential school, you see nothing, you hear nothing, and you say nothing. You could tell when they were overwhelmed with what happened to them, they'd go out and drink. I always wanted to know, why were our people the way they are? There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of addictions. The homes are split, and there were people that were having babies from other dads. So I couldn't figure out why we were the way we were, because we're not bad people. And when I was young, these were the questions that I asked myself, because when our people fought, they didn't do it behind closed doors. if they were going to fight, they were going to do it out in the open. Our people drank because they were troubled. And then I'm thinking, where did the trouble come from? And I'm thinking this out loud. And many years after, I got invited to do research on residential school. And I had that aha moment. And that circle was complete. When abuse is perpetuated and people are taken from their homes and not allowed to have a normal family and isolated from their families by going to residential school, something snaps, something is missing. That loving home environment, that is lost. And with residential school, they were more powerful than the police. In one interview, I didn't do this interview, one of the police were coming and they wanted the kids at that school to go into the building and go into the basement. And this one young kid was fooling around and he didn't hear, or he just didn't go into the building. And the one brother ran over him. And all these kids saw that.
It has a ripple effect on the next generations, and it's continuous. And that's where we need to understand what happened, to expose the truth, for healing to happen.
Residential schools. Well, my mom went, and she had to, I remember the stories because she passed away when I was a year old, but she had to sleep with her clothes on at night underneath her nightgown to avoid being abused and touched, and protection. But she seemed to have a nun that kind of took her under her wing, so she was pretty protected. And she had a letter written for her saying she was surprisingly smart for a savage. Just finishing their degrees gives them such a feeling of accomplishment, because in that time that they've earned their degrees, they have had relationship breakdowns. They've had children. I mean, they have children and they keep rolling, you know, like it's a couple of classes they miss and then they're back at it. And, you know, they've had deaths in their family. So finishing is such an accomplishment, and they have so much confidence that, yeah, they'll be real contributors to wherever they go, because they knew what it took, and they know the history. They have a background now in why their families are the way they are, and why, you know, First Nations communities are the way they are, and they understand that it's not their fault, and that any kind of persecution or judgment that they have faced before, they now have a standing of, you know, hold on a second, we didn't do this to ourselves. We're still suffering from it, but they have, you know, knowledge is power. They have the background now.
Like, it's hard to break that cycle, especially when stuff happened to you in the residential school, and like being sexually molested as a little kid. Like, that's a lot of trauma. And losing your language and trying to keep your traditions. Trying to break the cycle of not being educated, and like how they talk about us in the north.
I'm stopping the cycle because I know how the cycle continues, and that's what I learned.
I believe that they can change. They have the capacity to break out of that cycle and pursue some formal education.
You're doing something good for yourself, and you can pass this on to your children, and you can break that cycle. It gives you that ability to do that, to break that cycle. Because, like, once you have an education, once you start thinking critically, you don't look at the world the same way you did. Like, I know that I don't think about the world the same way I did before I came to university. And it's almost like education is the key that unlocks the rest, like your peripherals. And so you look at the world differently.
I would say it's helping to end the cycle, because it's it's given me more of a better insight on what to avoid in the future and how to avoid it. And not only that, it also helps me as a person work towards healing myself, because with the education I got from here so far, I finally found out like why things happened the way they were, not only in my personal life, but my family life. Being educated on it could give us the power to help those still affected by it in the future, wherever we end up working, whether it be social work, teaching, wherever.
Just being out in the world, and if I wasn't here, I wouldn't understand so much. But because I come here, they make you do research on certain traumas and certain stuff about residential, and you understand it more, and then you it's not just living it, it's like putting it all together.
Having an education and for my children, like showing them I don't drink, and they see me sitting at the table every night, and after they're done eating, they're cleaning my desk, they see. So like at the table at night, I'm sitting at the table and they're sitting there too. So I think it'll really benefit, because in the long run they'll want to follow me.
I know that coming here, I really like the holistic approach that some of my professors take in teaching us, like the social work. Like my social work 200 class, it was Introduction to Indigenous Social Work. A lot of it was focused on self-healing and healing yourself as you're trying to heal your people that you're going to be working with, your clients. And that was really interesting. And I think it's amazing, like a First Nations university, like who thought we would have, like, we'd be here, like would have our own place where we could come and feel safe and get an education among our own people. Not that we don't have like white people here or other people from different nations coming to this school, but it's nice being under a First Nations banner. I know that I came here for that very specific reason, was to get in touch with who I am as a person, because I never knew a lot about my heritage. Like I knew that I was Cree, and I knew that I was proud to be Cree, but there was no substance to that. Like I didn't know, my dad tried his best, but I didn't know a lot about my culture, and that's one of the reasons why I came to this school, is to get in touch with my culture again.
Having an education from FNU, it helps me learn about all this information I never learned about. Like in these Indig classes, we learn so much about residential schools and how they really affected First Nations people. I'm really glad I got the chance to go to school here, because it taught me so much already, and I'm only finishing up my first year. Like sure, times can get tough, but at this university there's lots of support around us, and I don't feel scared to ask for help here.
I would say a lot of our First Nations and Aboriginal students have challenges that non-Indigenous students don't have. I mean, they just don't. And so if they have access to cultural supports, it's something to really hang on to, like stick their teeth into, so that they have something tangible and solid to assist them through their semesters, rather than in other universities they would just drop out.
We don't have traditional or cultural basis in our communities, where there's no ceremonies, there's no traditional elders to be teaching the youth, and I think there needs to be more of that to definitely reconciliate the effects of intergenerational, because I think it took about 2 years to start participating in the ceremonies, because I started hearing like I don't need to believe in the practices that I'm participating in just to give it a shot, just to open up my mind to new concepts. And as soon as I did that, I realized like I was completely comfortable and loved being in ceremonies like that. it just made sense to me. Everything just felt like in harmony. So through going to First Nations University, I've gone to my first sweat.
Because having the elders and the traditional stuff that's offered here, and then, you know, what they teach for your like Indig classes and stuff like that, there are certain things that we specifically learn about Indigenous people that other, you know, universities won't really teach. They won't go into it as much as we will here. That will give us a better understanding of our people and why they are the way they are. Then also with the elders downstairs, they educated me more on how to do it better, because all I did was self-taught, right? So then I learned how to do it properly.
But it's like a part of who we are as people is our ceremonies. Sweats, for example, like they help alleviate the burden of like what I'm going through. And I think it's it's in my DNA to have that response to those things.
At other universities, you can really feel how big of a minority you are, because most of the students would not really want to talk to me, and they wouldn't really sit by me even in class. You could feel that segregation in the classrooms. You definitely feel like it's a smaller university, so you can see that the professors are really trying to help their students in their classrooms, and the students, you can feel how comfortable they are in the classrooms as well, and they're not afraid to ask questions during the class. At First Nations University, you're treated more as a person than as a number.
A correct step forward to healing. So that's one thing that needs to happen, is education.
My vision is that this university will open the doorway for the students that have been colonized, or are people that have been colonized, and they will demystify our culture, because our culture has been so badly demonized that it scares our people to go to those ceremonies. It scares our people to even talk that way.
The impact of residential schools and how education can bring healing to our people.
It's an important part of healing that that a person needs to be able to speak their language, that they can talk to elders about what they're going through, and the elders can give their wisdom on the traditional ways that people used to live and learn.
I think we're progressing with education, with awareness.
I'd say we're healing at a good pace.
You're part of it. Our elders said that we knew what was to come, and that a new day would come along. They said our nation would rise again. Through our walk, our education,